Welcome. This video is a prologue to a series of videos on identifying acute coronary occlusion based on the ECG. To learn how to identify acute coronary occlusion, we're first going to discuss the identification of occlusion based on a single ECG lead. Then we'll move on to identifying occlusion based on all of the ECG leads. Then we'll discuss characteristics of reperfusion and completed infarction. If you're going to take good care of patients experiencing coronary occlusion, you're going to need to understand the STEMI criteria and the limitations of them, and the limitations of the division of ACS patients into STEMI and NSTEMI categories. The good news is the necessity of contiguous leads is still a very important concept. To understand all this, let's take a look back at the history of the understanding of acute coronary syndrome. Before 1980, it was assumed that heart attacks were secondary to luminal obstruction by atherosclerotic deposits without really a role of plaque rupture. It wasn't until 1980 that an angiographic study determined that ruptured plaques cause ST elevation, which then evolves into Q-wave MIs. I'd venture that this study is the foundation for the definition of acute MI which persists today, which involves some combination of EKG changes, elevated enzymes, and a matching story. STEMI criteria were being discussed at this point. Later in the 80s, it was determined that lytics reduce mortality in the setting of acute MI. Then later in the 90s, it was determined that stenting works. It wasn't until the late 90s that the STEMI criteria were officially rolled out by the AHA and ACC to determine who gets lytics. Only cardiogenic shock or persistent hemodynamic instability warranted PCI with a Class II rec. Before long, everyone figured out that these criteria were very nonspecific. Nearly half of young men have over a millimeter of STE and multiple precordial leads. So in 2007, a time that all of you can probably remember, we met the STEMI criteria as we know them. This ugly tacked on set of age and gender specific criteria for V2 through V3. Good luck if you rupture an LAD plaque the day before you turn 40, gentlemen. STEMI criteria have been found by multiple studies to be less than 50% sensitive for coronary occlusion. So all of these STEMI equivalents in 2022 were officially tacked on to the STEMI criteria, and they are equally sufficient grounds for activating the cath lab. These include the notoriously difficult to define hyperacute T waves. So here are the realities of the STEMI era. Patients with ACS are divided into STEMI and NSTEMI. NSTEMI patients with coronary occlusion have doubled mortality at 1 year. And as noted earlier, STEMI criteria are less than 50% sensitive for coronary occlusion, so STEMI equivalents are getting added to the STEMI criteria. So here's how to see beyond STEMI era realities. First, recognize the patient as the one with the problem, not the ECG. Second, recognize that the patient is having the problem. ACS is a clinical diagnosis. Secondly, and this is the task at hand, learn to recognize the ECG by seeing with proportion, reciprocal, and dynamic eyes, not millimeter counting eyes. Third, advocate for the patient that is having the problem. Recognize that time is myocardium, and recognize when prompt PCI has the potential to make a great morbidity and mortality difference. Let's revisit our task through the lens of developing eyes for occlusive MI. Our first task is to see with proportion eyes. Our next task is to see with reciprocal eyes. And then our final task is to see with dynamic eyes. Watch the videos and you will understand what I mean. First, let's discuss those whose work forms the basis for these videos. Stephen Smith has devoted his life to moving ECG interpretation in acute MI beyond the STEMI era, and you can see this work for yourself and that of his sorcerer's apprentice Pendle Myers on the Smith ECG blog and in their many publications. These resources form most of the basis for the things in these videos. Jesse McLaurin, MD, is an excellent ECG interpreter and an excellent educator, and his ECG Cases blog is a great way to learn ECGs. Kay Wang is a cardiologist at Hennepin and the author of the text for our curriculum. He was mentored by Henry Marriott, regarded by cardiologists as the father of electrocardiology.